Good morning, debaters. This is part one of an economic inequality topic lecture for summer 2023. In this part, we'll talk about the resolution itself and give some background on inequality. But first, one of the most interesting things about policy debate is that we debate a topic over the course of an entire season, which means that these are really just an initial set of thoughts to get you started. I'm really hoping that any one of you who's watching this lecture could give your own topic lecture by December and maybe even a different one entirely by the end of the season. As debates happen, we develop different thoughts about how things are going and what's topical and what's not topical and what should be included and what shouldn't, what arguments are good and arguments are not as good, and the strengths of arguments change over time. So this is an initial set of arguments to get you started and give you the background knowledge you need to have initial debates on the economic inequality topic, but I hope your knowledge evolves over the course of the topic. So the resolution is what we are debating about this year. If you were to ask somebody, if somebody were to ask you what the topic is this year, you might say economic inequality or you might say fiscal redistribution. But we have an actual resolution. And this is the resolution. Resolved, the United States federal government should substantially increase fiscal redistribution in the United States by adopting a federal jobs guarantee, expanding Social Security, and or providing a basic income. And so all affirmatives on the topic that are attempting to be topical are going to defend one of those three areas, and they're going to do it by advocating fiscal redistribution. And we'll talk over the course of this lecture and the next one about what exactly that means and how the affirmative might do that, and again, how the negative might negate that. But first, I think it's important to understand a little bit more about economic inequality itself and understand economic equality in the United States specifically, because that's where the resolution is taking place. So what is economic inequality? Economic inequality is unequal distribution of income and or wealth throughout a population, meaning some folks have more and some folks have less throughout the population. It's the measurement of how much more and how much less different groups in society have. And there are sort of two ways to understand income inequality, or to understand economic inequality, which are income and wealth. And those are different concepts. So income is your earnings. It's the amount you make from a job or from a cell phone business. It is your paycheck. It's sort of what you make on a month-to-month basis. It also includes interest on savings and investments. So if a person has a bunch of investments, the interest on those investments is included in income, and it includes payments from social programs. So if a person is receiving welfare or they're receiving other social programs that give them a cash outlay each month, like Social Security, then those payments from those social programs would also be considered income. Wealth, another term for wealth, is net worth. And wealth is a little bit broader. It's the value of assets minus outstanding debt. So wealth includes things like houses, savings accounts, cars, other things like that. And it's not just individual to the person. Unlike income, wealth can be inherited. So wealth can be transferred from generation to generation. This gives you a question. Wealth inequality in a society is typically greater than income inequality. And I think that if you paused and thought about it for a little bit, you could probably figure out the reason for that. But it has to do with the fact that wealth can be transferred between generations. So income inequality is the difference between what someone's making on a regular basis, on a monthly basis, or a yearly basis, whereas wealth inequality accumulates across generations. So someone can be very wealthy without having very high income or without really having any income at all if they have received an inheritance of some type. And so wealth inequality tends to stack up across the generations, where wealthy families are able to pass down inheritance to their descendants, and non-wealthy families cannot. And so the benefits of wealth and the difference between wealthy and non-wealthy people in a society tend to increase over time. So wealth inequality in the United States is pretty significant. If you're looking at this chart, you'll see that about 12% of the population has less than zero wealth, meaning that they owe more than they have. Maybe they have a mortgage, and so they have less than zero wealth, or they have a car payment and they wouldn't have the funds to pay off that car. So those people, that group of people, which is a pretty substantial portion of society, has negative net worth. They owe more than they have. On the other end, about 2% of society has 40% of the share of the wealth. And so that sort of gives you an understanding that there is a big difference between the wealthiest in our society and the least well off in our society, with understanding that over time that can get greater or can get less depending on federal policies, depending on state policies. But right now, wealth is quite significant in terms of inequality in the United States. In general, both wealth and income inequality are increasing when we're talking across generations. If you look sort of over the time scale, these graphs both start, one of them starts in the 1970s for income inequality, the wealth inequality starts in the 1980s, and that's not a coincidence in that it wasn't always true that wealth and income inequality have been increasing, and we'll look at that in just a second. But in your lifetime and the lifetime of your parents, for the most part, gaps between the lowest income and the lowest wealth people in our society and the highest income and highest wealth people in our society have sort of continued to widen. And that can be different on a year-to-year basis, depending on what's going on with taxes or depending on what's going on with social services, depending on what's going on with the economy and unemployment. But on a generational understanding, on a many years understanding, on the last 50 years-ish understanding, wealth and income inequality are both increasing pretty significantly. But again, this wasn't always true. So it's from the sort of 1950s, the end of World War II until the 1980s, income tended to move in lockstep, which did not mean that everyone was earning the same, but it did basically mean that when incomes rose for the wealthiest portion of society, they were also rising for the least wealthy portion of society. You'll notice that red line on the left, the 95th percentile, the median, and then the blue line, the 20th percentile. Those lines pretty much stay together for a really long time, a period of time, about 30 years, considered the post-war decades from the end of World War II until about the beginning of the Reagan administration, and then they started to diverge. And a lot of that is due to policies that caused them to diverge. We'll look at some tax policies later on that maybe that are related to that. But it's important to understand that income inequality and wealth inequality weren't always increasing, that they used to be much lower than they were, and they used to move together, and now they don't. You will also notice that the percentage change in income after transfers and taxes since 1979 has also really diverged. So the top 1% has had a 226% change in income, whereas the bottom 20% is much lower. And actually, you'll notice the middle class is even lower than that. The middle 60% has gone up even less than the bottom 20%, and a lot of that is due to social services that have been provided to some of the bottom 20%, but don't get provided to that middle section of the economy. And so it has created a situation where the wealthy are getting much wealthier much faster than others. One interesting thing to note, though, is that wealth inequality narrowed a little bit during the early stages of the pandemic. So this is 2019 to 2021. So it includes that sort of full first year and a half of the pandemic. And it was a change in U.S. Household wealth level. And you'll notice that the bottom 50% went up a lot. The top 1% went up quite a bit. The next 9% went up quite a little less. The next 40% went up quite a bit less. But that bottom 50% went up a lot. And you might be thinking to yourself, but I thought there was pretty high unemployment during the pandemic. And there were obviously a lot of economic issues that people were facing in terms of healthcare, in terms of being able to provide for their families. But wealth inequality did narrow. And the main reason for that, you might be able to figure out, is that the federal government provided a bunch of stimulus checks. And those stimulus checks were provided to everyone. So different sets provided different amounts, and they provided different amounts based on how much you earned. But the key thing to understand is that the federal government was directly providing money to the people in society. They were providing income on a regular basis to people living in society, and that really did significantly narrow the wealth gap in our society, especially because people who earn the least obviously benefited the most from those checks. And so it makes a very big difference in your wealth if you are getting regular checks, if you are earning a very small amount, than if you're earning a very large amount. Someone who's making $1 million a year or something probably does not notice as much the $2,000 check, whereas someone who's making $12,000 a year, that's a huge percentage increase in how much money they have. And it allowed some people to get out of debt. It allowed some people to save money for the first time. Maybe they were able to pay off a car, or maybe they were able to, upgrade their housing situation, or have some other benefit to their local standard of living. But it is important to notice that the last time the federal government did just directly provide money to the people in the society, it did narrow inequality. However, the income inequality did not significantly change during the pandemic. That earnings inequality continued to grow, especially at the top. You'll notice that the top 0.1% is up 465%. The top 1% is up 200%, whereas the bottom 90% only changed by about 27%. And one of the interesting things about that is that it's actually really that the bottom 10% changed a lot more. The sort of 10% to 90% group didn't change very much at all, and some of them even lost earnings during the pandemic, whether they were put out of work or whether they struggled. But the people at the very bottom did have some earnings benefits, whether that was from the unemployment benefits that were expanded, whether that was from the child tax credit that was pretty significant during the pandemic and then went away. But it is sort of notable that income inequality continued to increase, mostly powered from the people at the very top earning a lot more. So we have some existing federal policies that are designed to combat inequality. One of them is that people who earn more tend to pay more in taxes, or at least that's the idea, that income taxes are higher at the higher levels. Another is that we have social services for lower income houses, things like food stamps or welfare, but they don't really change the overall inequality picture. You'll see on the left that before the taxes and transfers, the top 1% has 16% of the distribution of income, and after they have 13%. So it is, those two pies are pretty similar. They don't dramatically equalize after taxes and transfers. And so while we do have existing policies to alleviate income inequality and alleviate economic inequality, they do not fix income inequality. They are income inequality and economic inequality still very much exists. The United States is also a little bit of an outlier here. We have the highest income inequality among G7 countries. So those are democracies with relatively open economies. So these are sort of the countries that the United States compares ourselves to economically. And you'll notice that the United States has much higher income inequality than a lot of these other countries. This is a scale called the Gini scale, or GINI, where the 1 would be perfect income inequality, meaning one person in society owned everything and all the other people in society owned nothing. And 0 would be perfect equality, where everyone in society had the exact same amount. And so you'll see in the United States, we're a lot higher, we're a lot closer to 1 than like a Germany or a France, and really more than anyone else on the scale. Here's a global comparison that compares, so you can kind of see the regions of the world. Again, this is the same scale, but this one is multiplied by 10. So 65 means much more unequal, and the sort of light yellow color, that light green, with the 20 is the 20 on the scale is much closer to equal. And you'll see that the United States sort of stands out as being more unequal. It's not the most unequal by any means, but it's not doing great in terms of globally comparing ourselves to other countries. So an important question is why economic inequality matters, and that's not to say that people aren't concerned about poverty or they aren't concerned about people not having enough. But there's an important economic question that sort of asks why inequality is important unto itself. Does it matter that a society is unequal if everyone has enough, if everyone has a house and everyone has access to food and they have access to healthcare and education? does it really matter that some people have a lot more than others? And that's an interesting empirical question that economists get to debate about. But the economists that fall on the side of yes, inequality does matter, no matter, it's not just about the absolute amount each person has, but also about the relative amount, meaning it does matter if some people have a lot more, even if everyone has some. Those people sort of debate the question about what are the reasons to be concerned about inequality in particular. And here are some of the implications of inequality economically in a society. These aren't the only ones, but this is sort of where you'll start to see advantage areas developing. And those include a society with higher economic inequality has lower economic growth and economic stability compared to a similar economy with lower income inequality, even if everyone has, everyone's doing just fine. There's also increased populism and political instability. Countries that have high inequality tend to be less stable politically. They tend to have, less stable governments, more likely to have political instability that results in government difficulties. They also have decreased trust in government and democracy. I think you might imagine that a society where you can look around and see that some people have way more and through maybe no benefit of themselves, not because they did a lot more, but just because inequality perpetuates, those people would probably have a lot less trust in the government, and they would have a lot less trust in the voting process and whether that voting process is going to protect their interests. People in unequal societies also have shorter lifespans. There's direct health problems that come from inequality. Public health is worse overall. You're much more likely to have things like pandemics in societies that are unequal. That educational attainment overall is also lower in societies that have high inequality. So this sort of gives you an idea of the range of problems that come from inequality. And again, these are problems from inequality itself, not just from poverty, but from the actual discrepancy between the lowest and the highest in society. There are a bunch more, and you'll get to explore them over the course of the year. But for now, come back for part 2, which is going to be key concepts in the resolution, where we'll talk about what some of these words means, what we'll be debating, and some of the detailed concepts in the resolution. Thanks for stopping by, and I hope to see you again soon.